The room is pretty full. Please don't sit in the fire exits and make sure to clear out when there's a fire for those who are standing. Yeah, Dan Kaminsky, I think, is everybody knows him. That's why so many people here. And he holds these talks almost every year, and he was here 4 years ago. So now, please give a warm welcome to Dan Kaminsky and his Black Ops of TCPIP.
Man, I've been waiting 4 years for this. Who here was at the last camp? Yeah, that's right. It was that awesome. All right, so hi, I'm Dan Kaminsky, and I write code. Man, for a while there, I was sure I was going to do this. No, so I do lots of stuff professionally. I'm not here today to fix authentication. I'm working on that. I'm not here to make DNSSEC scale. I'm working on that too. No, today I am here to play with old toys. I'm here for a return to form. Back in the day, I used to play with packets, and then I stopped and DNS became the obsession. Well, I miss packets. It's been too long. As a community, we've sort of stopped looking at network security. And this is the art of mapping networks and evading firewalls and subverting design assumptions. And to be honest, this is probably the right thing if you want to work on important stuff, right? I mean, if you just look at attacks, come on, it's the same game over and over again. You get a beachhead, you get your first box through SQL injection, or marry an HR who has to open your stupid little PDF. And then you just lily pad. You bounce from host to host to host using stolen credentials. And compared to all that, how important is firewall games and mapping games and all of that stuff? That's not very important, right? I don't give a crap. This shit's fun, and I'm gonna do it. So we're gonna look into some NetSec stuff, and maybe we'll find something cool. Bitcoin. Oh God, Bitcoin. I saw the greatest shirt yesterday. Was, "Here is my conversation starter, Bitcoin." Like with the icons even. It was great. Bitcoin turns nerd forums into libertarian forums. It's infected pretty much everything else, so why not our talk? What is it? Well, it's an attempt at making a digital currency with no central bank. It is a system with economic properties I don't know anything about. I don't know, I'm not an economist. That's okay, neither are most economists. Bitcoin is an overlay network upon the internet that people believe has certain properties. Now I get to play. So, what is Bitcoin in a nutshell? Bitcoin is based on doing 3 separate things. 1, transferring money. I, Alice, give Bob 2.1 Bitcoins. 2, gossiping. Hey everyone, did you hear Alice gave Bob 2.1 Bitcoins? And that information flies around a peer-to-peer network. Then a third piece of thing. Everyone, the official registry of transactions should now include Alice paying Bob, and Bob paying Charlie, and Charlie paying David, and so on. Now this information is gossip too. You might say, well, what prevents everyone from gossiping it? Well, they basically say every 10 minutes someone will do a cryptographic problem that is so difficult it can only happen once every 10 minutes. You might say, how does it make once every 10 minutes? Well, if it happens any faster, they just make the problem harder and harder and harder until finally it takes the world 10 minutes to solve the problem. It's actually quite elegant. So the truth of Bitcoin, this is not my Bitcoin talk. You can go to dankaminsky.com if you want that. But Bitcoin's really impressive. Like I'm not joking. Entire classes of bugs are just missing. See, we're used to in security being able to be real presumptuous and say, sure, this looks okay on the surface, but I'm just gonna scratch it and it's gonna fall over and die. And that is totally not the Bitcoin story. Bitcoin looks like crap when you first look at it, and then it's like, haha, all those bugs you thought were there, we fixed those 2 years ago and we didn't even comment out the fix. It's not buggy. That's actually kind of impressive. Bitcoin has fixed almost all the flaws that are not forced by the design. Yeah, that's not foreboding at all. Yeah, so the core issues in Bitcoin, it does not scale, and it is totally not anonymous. And we're going to talk about this now. With regards to scalability, don't look at me, just like go to their scalability page. They're like, yeah, we're going to need to move like a gigabyte a second eventually. Like on every node in the world is going to have to move a gigabyte a second. Yeah, that doesn't work, guys. Neither does having 50 CPUs that everyone needs to constantly run to keep up. And then there's this really funny thing. Well, okay, we might have to have a lot of storage, but a 3 terabyte hard drive, that's only $200 every 21 days. You just need, that's not a big deal. Okay, yeah, so they don't scale, and they know they don't scale. You end up with super nodes and normal nodes. There are nodes that go ahead and do all the work for Bitcoin, and then there's other. We have a name for these other nodes. They're called banks. So, welcome to the new boss. Looks suspiciously like the old boss. I'm not saying banks are bad. I got a couple banks that have money of mine, but this peer-to-peer model with all of these characteristics like financial transactions can't be reversed. All of this stuff goes away. Eventually. But for now we can do something useful. So Travis Goodspeed, I don't know if you guys have ever met him, great guy. He walks up to me the other day and he says, maybe a month ago, and says, hey Dan, any chance we can use Bitcoin as a samizdat service, a place to store information? Now the funny thing is this is actually an old internet challenge. The internet is usually about sending data from point A to point B, after which it's immediately forgotten. The variant of that is, can we store data? Some people a while ago were trying to do this by having pings that went out, and then it stored data in the time it took for it to come back. They called it ICMP moon bounce. That worked for a few seconds. I'd like something that works forever. Well, if Bitcoin is going to eventually require a 3 terabyte hard drive to store data every 21 days, and is going to have to store that data forever, this is an interesting situation. So who here, by any chance, knew a good friend of mine, Len Sassaman? Len was one of our shining lights. And if one goes to the Bitcoin archive of all transactions ever, there's a command that's on every Unix box. It's called strings. It finds human-readable text in anything. Now, the Bitcoin database is at least 450 megabytes. It's eternally growing and will eternally grow. If you run strings on the Bitcoin database to see what is in there, yes, there are lots of transactions. There is also a 78-line tutorial to Len, a testimonial to Len, complete with ASCII art, and to just say it out loud, because Len should be here now. Len was our friend, a brilliant mind, a kind soul, and a devious schemer. He was husband to Meredith, brother to Calvin, son to Jim and Dana Hartshorn, co-author and co-founder and Shmoo and so much more. We dedicate this silly hack to Len, who would have found it absolutely hilarious by me and Travis. And just because Len would have been so amused to see that fact that Bitcoin now can't work, you can't remove this stuff without making Bitcoin break. There's a little bit more thrown in. Bitcoin isn't exactly the biggest fan of the United States Federal Reserve, so we did kind of put a picture of the head of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, also into Bitcoin as a new dependency. So how do we do this? Well, in Bitcoin, Alice gives money to Bob by issuing sort of a challenge. Whoever can sign a message with the public key that hashes to the following bytes may claim this money. Well, bytes are bytes. Instead of pushing the hash of a public key, we just push lines of a testimonial. It works quite nicely. It does cost money, about 1.0 Bitcoins in total. That's worth an increasingly smaller amount of money. This does destroy the money permanently. The network thinks that somewhere, somehow, there's an ECC public key that hashes to Len was our friend. I am totally okay with that. This is the cyber equivalent of pouring one out for your homies. So, can we get higher bandwidth? Well, we can go ahead and send money to a public key directly instead of a hash. That gets us from 20 bytes to 200 bytes. That, by the way, is why the testimonial was thin, because it was only 20 byte hashes. We could get 200 bytes, but then there's another thing. Bitcoin allows extra data in a signature. Here's how. Bitcoin works with small programs. The program from the receiver is put this signature and public key on a stack, and pile of data. And the program from the sender is take the signature and public key off the stack and make sure they're good. Well, what if there's extra data on the stack? The program just says, take the signature and public key off the stack. It doesn't say, go look for any extra stuff. So you could just put like megabytes of extra crap and it's still valid. And it turns out it's not just valid for the sender. When you have a signature can't sign itself, right? It's a chicken and egg problem. There's bytes, you want to sign them, that's fine, but you can't sign the bytes. You can't sign the bytes in the thing that you're signing because there's a chicken and egg. So signatures don't cover the presence and absence of additional data within themselves. Now, when a block is calculated in Bitcoin, when, like I said earlier, that thing that is calculated every 10 minutes, when that thing shows up, it absolutely covers everything in the signature, including any extra crap that might show up. But that happens after 10 minutes. There is a period of time between when the transaction goes out and when the transaction is made permanent forever that not just the sender can add extra data, but like anyone can go ahead and add extra data. And Bitcoin doesn't notice. Now, there's some limited usefulness. If you're just some random person who's adding stuff, yeah, you are limited by what's called transaction fees. You can only put in a little bit of extra data before you aren't contributing enough wealth to the network to be able to add data. But if you are generating the signature, you can generate the transaction fees. And if you want to put a couple megabytes of data in your transaction, a video instead of just a 20-character testimonial, you can do that. And also, if you're the guy who's going ahead and doing the work every 10 minutes, yeah, you can add data as well. So the answer to Travis, yes, Bitcoin FS, totally possible. All right. Now let's talk about what people really like talking about with Bitcoin, which is anonymity. What is the actual story of Bitcoin's anonymity? Well, there's this website called Block Explorer that shows you everything that's going on in the Bitcoin network. And basically what you have is a series of sources and destinations. All those identities on the left are paying those two identities on the right. Now here's the deal. All those dudes on the left, same dude. One of those guys on the right, same guy. So there's a lot of the rule in Bitcoin is because there's no central bank, everyone needs to cart around and publish all of the transactions that have ever occurred, or be dependent on someone else who is. So the list of transactions that have ever happened are public, and this is from one particular transaction. And all those identities on the left are the same identity. And from that, you end up getting these great little graphs you can make to sort of de-anonymize people. This is from a paper from Reed and Harrigan, and it was the big Bitcoin is not anonymous paper. Now, they got lucky. What I just told you said you can link pseudonyms. But finding out that fake identity A is fake identity B, that's useful, but it's not enough. You need at least IP addresses. Well, in Reed Harrigan, they're saying, well, one source published the IP address. Another situation, this guy just went onto a forum and said, hi, I'm Jackass in Washington, D.C., and I'm looking for money, and here's my Bitcoin ID. This is not a normal thing you can depend on for de-anonymization. And, the guys know it. Naturally, most of this analysis is circumstantial. We can't really say whether all these flows implied shared agency. Is there another source of data? Well, sure, absolutely. There are two sources of transaction information in Bitcoin. There's the stuff that's carried around forever, the blocks that are set in stone that everyone ends up getting. But there's also all of the loose transactions, the Alice is paying Bob notes, that would like to be getting into the list of transactions that are now permanent. And now both things are gossiped around the network. You know, Alice tells Bob and Charlie, Bob tells David and Eric, Charlie tells Frank and Gary. And that's how it works. It's a big, you know, poof, burst around the internet. So this is very nice. If you just connect to every Bitcoin node in the world, the first node to tell you about a transaction, yeah, it's him. He is relaying you the information because he is the information. He's the source. Now, this requires connecting to every single node in the Bitcoin network, but we can do that. Like 50,000 connections, you can do that in Python. You can do that in scripting languages. So I wrote a piece of code called Blitcoin that does accelerated probing of Bitcoin. Just connects to everyone. Now, how do you know who to connect to? All right, well, the first thing you do is just scan the entire internet on 8333 TCP. I mean, hey, that actually scales. You can join the IRC channels. It turns out Bitcoin runs itself quite a bit like a botnet command and control network. You just connect to 101 channels. They're like Dalmatians. They give you all the information you could want. You can also connect to every single Bitcoin node or a couple of Bitcoin nodes and say, tell me about who you know. And you just do that recursively to everyone, and you end up with a huge number of Bitcoin nodes. And if you actually talk to the Bitcoin devs, they're like, oh yeah, we aren't anonymous at all. We have no idea what these internet hippies are talking about. It's more private than a credit card or PayPal transaction. It's less private than cash. You're going to get owned is basically what they say. And it's fair enough. Now, what about Tor? Does Tor save the day? Well, Tor does obfuscate IPs derived from outbound connections. So when someone relays to you and says, hey, Alice paid Bob, and this is the first time you've heard about it, yeah, it's the first time you've heard about it, but you get a Tor IP address. Now, what Tor doesn't handle is inbound connections. When you scan the internet for 8333 TCP, you see all the Bitcoin nodes, not just the Bitcoin nodes that are not using Tor. No, you see the Tor nodes too, and Tor doesn't protect inbound connectivity. So there's actually a bug that's been filed in Bitcoin to shut off inbound connections when Tor is active. Unreachable nodes. Most nodes are behind NAT. They're behind little firewalls. They only connect via outbound links. The active inbound set is only 3,000 to 8,000 nodes, as opposed to what could be 60 to 80,000 outbound nodes that are totally out there. All right, well, what that means is that those 60 to 80,000 nodes are dependent on whatever the 3,000 to 8,000 nodes are. So you just create a few thousand nodes, and now all the outbound only guys are like, well, I'm statistically going to connect to 7 nodes, and one of them is going to be you who's trying to do de-anonymization. So that works pretty well. You probably only need about a couple hundred nodes, if that, in order to get at least one connection from every single outbound only connection. Just how unreachable are these outbound only nodes, by the way? This is an interesting question. See, most users are behind wireless routers, and the routers implement NAT, where outbound connections are easy, but inbound connections are difficult. Poor man's firewall. And don't knock it, it's worked better than most firewalls for most years. Who here knows about UPnP? Awesome. Listen, UPnP is a great protocol that allows nodes inside of your network to say, listen, I got to have some inbound connectivity because I'm going to play some Call of Duty and I want to shoot some dudes. Bitcoin supports UPnP by default now, but even if it doesn't, and its older versions don't, you got to understand how UPnP is supposed to work. You're basically sending out a broadcast that says, hey, do I got like an internet router on this network? And then your router replies yes, and you say, hey, router, open some ports for me, and it says, okay, I'll open some ports. UPnP is only supposed to work on like the internal side of your network. It'd be really bad if these routers were like, hey, internet, you want me to like open up anything on this internal net? God damn it. Yeah, so there's like 100,000 to 1 million at least routers out there that will go ahead and accept inbound connections. Not all of them on a simple scan are actually fully open. See, there's a randomizer on the HTTP side of UPnP. And everyone was supposed to implement that, and all the code based on Microsoft stacks actually did. But then everyone else didn't. And yeah, so entire countries have standardized NATs that aren't actually firewalls. You can just sort of ask them nicely to open up the firewall, and there you go. So I'm not going to go too much into depth in it. It turns out someone found this before me back at DEF CON. I should have edited these slides a bit. But yeah, there's another guy, Daniel Garcia, who basically found most of the routers in the Dominican Republic. You can just say, hey, open up your firewall. This stuff's been going on for years. Armin Hemmel actually found a bunch of stuff too. So stay tuned on the UPnP front, because it really does look like this is another major router screw-up. But let's talk about stuff outside the consumer space. So a little bit about corporate environments. I'm sure a few of you are in them. Corporate environments are really all about, their firewalls are about access control lists. We pretend that they're not. We pretend that they're, oh, great, crazy IPsec stuff. But that's really difficult to deploy. It is so much easier to just make sure you're listening to connections from the appropriate IP addresses. And you might say, but what about IP spoofing? Those access control lists say, only 4221 can get through. What if a bad guy just pretends to be 4221? The answer is that totally works. And if you're a networking guy, you say, but there are best practices, and best practices promise that no one on the internet will be able to spoof traffic and pretend to have a certain identity. Yeah, best practices, BCP38, this works pretty well for like cable modems and like DSL lines. But the moment you have like an actual internet connection, you are moving traffic in ways that the network guys have no idea how to go ahead and set up filtering for. So they don't, because they can't, because if they break once, they're fired, basically. So spoofing is really easy with one exception. If you have a cloud node, cloud nodes actually have hypervisors, and the hypervisors actually do go ahead and filter spoof traffic. So we finally found a use for the cloud. All right, so listen, is IP spoofing still effective? All right, so this is not a DNS trick. This is not a DNS talk, but here's an old DNS trick. You generate a query for some random name, .attacker, a domain you control.com. And you just flood queries for that name all over the internet. And you flood them to various destinations from their own neighbors, either their 2-byte neighbor or their 3-byte neighbor. And the idea is that you're saying if you're going to have an access control list, usually you're going to have access control lists that allow direct neighbors from within your organization to go ahead and contact you. So you go ahead, you send this query, it gets through the access control list, and eventually finds a name server, because there's always a name server on pretty much any network. Well, the name server, if it's going to send a reply, it's going to send a reply back to the neighbor. You're never going to actually see the reply. But this is DNS. When you ask a server to look up foo.com, it doesn't know the answer for foo.com. So it goes ahead and says, well, hey, internet, where's foo.com? Or in this case, it says, hey, internet, where's random.attackerdomain.com? So you do not get the response, but you get the forwarded request. And this lets you go ahead and find out paths through access control listed networks. Now, granted, this only works for obscure protocols like DNS and UDP. Certainly nothing built on TCP. All right, limits of IP spoofing. Here's some very basic stuff. I can't believe we're still talking about this crap in 2011. Most protocols run over TCP. It's a reliable communication protocol. Alice sends Bob a SYN, and it contains a random sequence number. Bob is going to reply with a SYN-ACK that's going to copy the original SYN sequence, and it's going to have its own sequence number. And then Alice replies to Bob with an ACK with both sequences. It's sort of like a password for communication. If you can prove the ability to receive traffic, in other words, prove you're not faking your source IP, then you're able to go ahead and go from the handshake into the part of TCP that actually exchanges payloads. If Alice is spoofing her IP, she doesn't see responses, she must be bad. So, sequence numbers did not used to be random. And this was a big problem in the 90s, and people started injecting data into sessions because even though they didn't have the passwords, they knew enough to figure out what the passwords would be. So, what do we do? Go ahead and make them random? Okay, well, turns out there's an edge case. The edge case is, look, connections are established between IPs and ports. So you have an IP address and a port connect to an IP and another port. Sometimes these 4 values are copied from one connection to the next. What if a packet arrives from an old connection? It could look like it belongs into the new one, and the bytes that happen to be there might show up from back in the day into present attempt at communication. And that would be very, very bad. So the fix is that you normally have random sequence numbers, but in case you go ahead and have all 4 the same, then we go sequential. Our assignments are set up to try to have the maximum distance between the sequence numbers of the old session and the sequence numbers of the new. And this is what it looks like. You have some function. It's from RFC called 1948. You have a function where 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 50,080 and a secret ABCD leads to 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. We add time, and now it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just one byte changes from 5 to 6 on that destination IP. All of a sudden, we have a totally different sequence number, and we're out in the 8999 space. But if the initial thing comes back, yeah, we go ahead and we're back to 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4. So the idea is nothing changes, we go sequential. Anything changes, we go random. So problem. Let's talk about memory for a second. What if someone just floods us with connection attempts? They don't have to remember all of our passwords. They're just going ahead and throwing connections at us thousands and thousands a second. They don't have to remember everything, but we need to remember everything. So eventually we run out of memory. This is a SYN flood, and it is old as dirt. Solution is SYN cookies. It's specified, if not invented, by Dan Bernstein in 1999, and weirdly, coincidentally, finally on by default in Linux in 2008. In this situation, the password is no longer a remembered value. It's actually more of a challenge. It's if you can send this back to me, then I will go ahead and reconstruct all the things you need in order to be able to communicate with me. I will figure out everything I needed to act like, okay, we finished our handshake, now we can do data. And SYN cookies use 3/4 of the sequence number space, 24 bits, to store the hash of a secret and the 4 tuple. And there's 5 bits of data used for time and 3 bits used for connection metadata. The 5 bits has no security value because you're giving time out to everyone in the world. So it's really only 24 bits. Well, what does that mean? 2 to the 24 is 16 million. 50% chance drops us to 8 million. That means if you send 8 million packets to someone with a payload, 50% of the time it's going to accept your payload from whatever IP address you claim. Now, of course, DJB is a genius, so he knew this. He said no matter what function is used, the attacker will succeed in connection forgery after millions of random ACK packets. Well, the only thing is it's kind of different than 1989, guys. Sending 8 million packets is easy now. I was dealing with a 700,000 packet per second flood the other day, and this was a small one. The forged connections have arbitrary sources, and they can contain arbitrary web services payloads. So if you have like a REST endpoint or a SOAP endpoint, if you have something that is waiting for web traffic, and it's like, well, it's unauthenticated, but it's okay because it's behind an access control list, realize with 8 billion attempts, bad guy can actually just force their way through. Works rather nice. Now what if you disable SYN cookies? See, you could potentially have an entire 32-bit range. 2 to the 32, that's 4 billion packets. That's quite a bit more packets to notice. So if you just disable SYN cookies, are you safe? Well, you see on Linux, Linux is RFC 1948 compliant for the lower 24 bits. But for the upper 8 bits, no, that's a counter. It's sequential. It starts at 0. It keeps incrementing by 1 once every 5 minutes. And it's shared between inbound and outbound connections. So even when SYN cookies are disabled or aren't triggered, you can go ahead and you send a single packet, a single connection request once, and it'll tell you, oh, you tried to connect. Here's the upper 8 bits of my reply. This is all this stuff is now fixed. And you can just flood 24 bits again. And again, it's 8 million packets to be able to inject into inject past an ACL. There's a couple other variants, though. Tony Watson, back in, I think, 2005, looked at what about resets? What if you're not trying to spoof your way in from a random IP? What if you're trying to shut a connection down? And he said, well, in a reset attack, you only have a single 32-bit field, and this single 32-bit field is limited by what's called windows, meaning you don't need to guess all 32 bits. You need to guess, well, you can shut it down to about 16 bits because there's a range, and oh, that range may be expanded, so we're going to lose another 5 to 8 bits, and then oh, the top 8 bits are fixed, and that means you actually have a possible worst-case scenario of a single packet, and you can shut down arbitrary connections between hosts and destination as some like random third party. That's kind of cool. Now, what about the worst case? Injection. See, in resets, when you're shutting something down, there's only one password. There's only one sequence number you got to match, and that's the seek in the direction of the reset. But if you're trying to inject a session between, I don't know, some random web browser and Google, like if you're trying to build the world's most ridiculous cross-site scripting attack, well, there's 64 bits of security. 2 to the 64 is a tremendous value. But, oh, well, we lose 16 bits from Alice's window of valid ranges. So now we're down to 48. And we lose another 16 bits from Bob. So that's 32. We lose another 5 from Alice's window scaling. So that's 27. Another 5 from Bob's window scaling. That's 22. And now we're down to only 1 million packets for a injection into a stream. And now we lose another 8 from Alice, another 8 from Bob. That leaves us with 6 bits. That gives us 16 packets for a 50% chance of injecting into a session. Why do I give you this math? I give this to you by example. You have a scenario that starts out looking quite secure, but this group took this batch of bytes, and that group took that batch of bits, and as it goes over and over and over again, eventually you end up with just a few shards of security that can be brute forced through. Ports. Linux randomizes the source port of a connection by default. You don't worry about this when you're doing an ACL bypass because you control all the ports. But if you're trying to inject into a session, when the browser connected to Google, it went ahead and it used a fairly random source port. And because it used a fairly random source port, you might have an extra 13 bits of security. There's an extra bit of randomness. Instead of 16, you add 13, you get 19. That means there's a 250,000 packets required for a 50% chance of injection. That's still absolutely within the realm of feasibility, but it's not, 16 packets. And note, by the way, sometimes the TCP client will go ahead and set a port explicitly. That happens in DNS. It also happens in BGP, the routing protocol that makes the internet kind of work. So status, it turns out this is very old code in Linux. It actually predates the check-in history of Linus Torvalds himself. Which is kind of crazy. This was written in the 90s. I was saying here that they're still figuring out the right fix. It looks like stuff just got checked into Linux 3.0 for how they're going to go ahead and have full 32-bit sequence numbers, which is rather nice. All right, a digression. RFC 1948 is an interesting construction. You have a scenario where data is sequential and ordered if you have the key, and is random and unpredictable without. You can participate with either a private component, the secret that is mixed in with the source port, desk port, source IP, dest IP, in which case you can generate all possible sequence numbers. But there's a public component as well. And in the public component, there's a sample sequence number that works that one time for that one 4 tuple. And it has to be successfully received over the network and then retransmitted from the receiver back to the sender. If you look at it, it's kind of like public-private cryptography with nothing but a password. Now, clearly, this is impossible. It's only impossible here because we have this strange definition of what public and private is. We're saying public means you can see stuff on the network. Now, I'm about to tell you something. That's a totally bad idea. But I'm pretty sure nowhere did it say when submitting a talk to CCC Camp that everything you were submitting had to be a good idea. It could actually be awful, which I promise you this is. Passwords are constantly being lost and stolen. They're responsible for 50% of compromises. They increasingly look like leet speak. But supposing we ignore all that, supposing we assume we're stuck with them, how do we use a password to log into a system without the system learning our password? Well, our common answer is always, we will hash our passwords. And it's like, I don't care if you're hashing passwords. Yeah, your database has a hash, but your web app is seeing plain text. And guess what? The bad guys can figure out how to tap your web app and read the stupid data coming in on the form. It's not that big a deal. You're also, there's not that much, if the salt is omitted, in other words, if there's, you're just taking the data and hashing it, a bad guy can just go ahead and say, well, I'm just going to go ahead and have a list of all standard pieces of data hashed with a password. So, it's not a very good technology here. Another attempt is we would challenge you to hash your password with something. So in other words, server sends a challenge to the client of, hey, hash the password with foobar. And the client's like, haha, here's the hash of foobar password. And then that's what's sent to the server. Digest and NTLM are more advanced versions of this. Here's the problem. The server still needs to know the plain text password. Has to know what is to be hashed with whatever the challenge had to be. So in some ways, this is actually worse. And the third way, we require knowledge of your password to go from a key pair to a shared session secret. This is basically doing anonymous public key crypto exchange, but you authenticate it by modulating your communication with the password. Speak and SRP use this. It requires the client and server to run some fairly obscure stuff, and good luck getting either deployed. What else can we do? Is it possible, not advisable, it's obviously a bad idea, but is it possible to build a system where the client only remembers the password, but the server stores nothing but a standard public key, and in fact, deploys nothing but a standard challenge for that public key to make sure that the client actually has the private version? Just to explain it in the audience, if you don't know what public-private cryptography is, a public key is a photo of your face. Everybody can look at it, everyone can recognize you. A private key is your face. It's really hard for me to smush my face into someone else's appearance. So that's kind of the basic idea of public-private cryptography. How do I make something where someone else has like a photo, and me, I don't even have like some complex face, I just got like a password. In other words, can we construct a cryptographic key pair out of a password? Who here knows what vulnerability impacted all asymmetric crypto systems, be they RSA, DSA, or ECC? Anyone? Really funny bug a few years ago. I can't hear you. All right, we'll have some tequila after this talk. Excellent. So, a few years back, the Debian operating system did some changes to random number generation in OpenSSL that said every time you look for random numbers, you got the exact same random numbers. And so all asymmetric crypto systems were broken by this because all of them grab random bits and then permute them. Change those bits until they can get a private key and a public key. Well, predictable entropy leads to predictable key pairs no matter what the algorithm is. So what if we turn the Debian bug into a feature? See, cryptography is all about constructions, right? You can take an encryption function and turn it into a fingerprinting hash function and vice versa. We totally know how to take a password and use it as a seed to what's called a pseudo-random number generator. In fact, there's an algorithm called scrypt that not only will take a password and turn it into a stream of numbers, but it'll make it take, a few seconds of CPU processing and a whole bunch of memory. So those guys at LComps off of the GPU can go pound themselves. So what do we do with this? What if we make the output of a password seed a PRNG, the input to an asymmetric key generator? We get a truly terrifying and ugly and bad and awesome idea. You end up with a 2048-bit RSA key pair with a trap door in the form of a password. This, my friends, is not theoretical. Here is SSH keygen. It is a tool for SSH that generates keys. When you run it, it will generate 3 different keys. If you use my little piece of code that I'm about to release called Fidelius, Fidelius takes the LD preload, Fidelius.so, takes a password of high grandma, and then you run it twice, and you get the exact same key material. So why is it Fidelius? Well, because Harry Potter, properly understood, is the story of the epic consequences of losing one's password. Fidelius, there's like 2 people in the room who know Harry Potter, and this should be funny to you. Fidelius is how passwords fail in the Harry Potter universe. So I thought I'd have a pay-on to that which fails. What does Fidelius do? Fidelius hooks dev-random, dev-urandom, OpenSSL's random functions. Basically, every time an application tries to get some random data, I'm like, have I got some scrypt for you? And it totally works, and it causes all of these real-world applications to provide predictable output for the exact same input. So that's SSH keygen works. OpenSSL will generate consistent certificates. You can actually get a certificate authority to sign a password. And Freebird will generate DNSSEC keys. This allows message signing, message encryption, client certificate authentication with nothing but a password. It actually solves the login with a password without the system learning your password problem thoroughly, without you having to store anything. In fact, mixed with Bitcoin, you can give money to it also works not just with words, but with photos. You give money to a photo of someone. It's actually pretty generic. The nice thing is that there's no pain for server side. All the time, memory hard requirements are on the client. The server just acts like it's always been acting with public-private key pairs. Primary issues. Well, the obvious one, it uses passwords. Passwords aren't very good. The secondary one is passwords tend to be low entropy. The not obvious things, it's very fragile. We're not just using SSH keygen. We're using SSH keygen 5.3p1 on Linux version whatever. And that's the only thing that generates the exact proper asymmetric keys. So it's it's an implicit system. It's sort of accidentally working, and there's a consequence to that. The other problem is that it's hard to salt. See, all users with the same password get the same certificate. They build the same public key. So that's a bit of a problem. Yeah, it is, really is. Told you, this is not a good idea. Don't do this. You can salt with Fidelius, but not in the way that it's been engineered right now. See, the way it's been engineered right now, the idea is if you have the password, you can generate the private key. You can also build a system where if you have the password and the public key, then you can generate the private key. And in such a system, protocols like SSL give you the public key before you do anything. So you can walk up to them and say, hey, give me the public key. Okay, here's the public key. I've got a few parameters in here, like a salt, like something to randomize it to make sure not everyone has the same password or the same private. And then now I can go ahead and generate whatever needs to be generated. And you can put parameters in here as well. But as fun and silly as that is, let's get back to the last part of this talk. It should take approximately 12 minutes. Let's talk about the last thing we do with networks. And this actually turned out to be my favorite thing that I've worked on in a while. Who here has been following the net neutrality debate at all? So, there's a real threat that ISPs are going to turn around. Once upon a time when it came to manipulating my traffic, I only had to worry about you guys. But now it's like ISPs are all trying to get on it, and apparently they thought you had the right idea. There's a real question about biased networks. I don't care. I care. I'm not worried about the obvious biases, right, where it's like entire domains are shut down, because it's pretty easy to figure out that happened. No, what I'm worried about is the subtle stuff. I'm worried about where there's deniable changes. What I'm about to show you is going to show you that we're going to be able to find biased networks, no matter how subtle they happen to be. If biased networks are affecting you, this is what you're going to be able to show in a court of law. And if you happen to work for an ISP that has some very strange filters installed, now is the time to shut the filters down before the code is public. Here's the deal. Hey, I work with ISPs. I at least need to give them a chance not to be on the front page in the New York Times. All right, listen. Here's your standard topology. You got a client, buying some totally broken home router. Got an ISP. The ISP's got multiple links to the internet, and those links take you to Google and Microsoft and Yahoo or wherever you guys are going these days. All right, so the threat is this. You have the magic box. It's deployed within the ISP network in front of all links. This magic box matches packets to policies and applies various rules to different packets. It can be stateless. Hey, do I like this packet? Or it can be stateful. This packet is part of a flow. Do I like this flow? Policies can be anything and can do everything. They can limit maximum bandwidth. They can increase minimum latency. They can alter content. They can do all sorts of things, and they don't necessarily need to announce publicly that they're doing them. Let's say Bing.com is 50 milliseconds slower than Google.com. Is this because of the ISP? Or is this because Google.com has better hosting, or there's different routes between Google and the ISP, or there's a million reasons why, and you can't really bust anyone because there's a little bit of a change. What this means is that there's plausible deniability. And what we have to do as testers is make this deniability implausible. So what do we need? We need normalization. Whether a tester is accessing Bing.com or Google.com, the network path should be identical, or at least uncorrelated with the path of communication. We call this normalization. That way, any changes would be the effect not of the server, which is the same, or the network path, which is the same, but the ISP at the end. So simple normalization. Let's imagine there was an HTTP filter. This will find stuff like today. All flows associated with an HTTP request for www.bing.com should be delayed by 50 milliseconds. Well, you just configure a single server on the internet to accept HTTP requests for Bing and Google and this and that. You don't even need to write any code because this is a proxy server. You just go ahead and you have a client connect to a proxy server, request different sites, and if different sites arrive from the same server over the same network path with different characteristics, you know you got a policy engine that's HTTP based. Problem. It's very protocol dependent. HTTP can be made to do this at low work, but other protocols require a ton of work to implement and emulate. You know, the internet, it turns out, is more than just the web. So, the other problem is the policy can be specific to IP addresses. You sniff DNS, you see which IP addresses a given target is using, and you just filter those. So it doesn't matter if you build a network neutrality detection, mega cluster with IP addresses all over the world. You've got like 400, but none of them are Bing, none of them are Google, and so you're never going to trigger the policy. So what I've written is Neuter, the network neutrality engine. Neuter. Neuter is just a VPN, guys. Traffic is pushed from a client to a broker. Broker, you might call it a VPN concentrator. How many people here have ever used a VPN? Nice. Okay, so just imagine in your mind, before you've learned anything, Neuter's a VPN. You got your network connection behind some ISP. The ISP isn't so good. You go ahead and you VPN off to where things are great. You had an IP address, there's a broker or a connection, a concentrator out there. It connects to Google, it connects to Bing, it connects all these things. Google and Bing all reply to the broker, and the broker now encrypts its traffic back to you. And now you are pretty much guaranteed not to be a victim of the per server filter, because the ISP doesn't know what you're connecting to. Doesn't know if those packets are Bing, doesn't know if it's Google. And so you might say, well, now there's not a problem. Well, I want to actually know if there's a filter. Maybe there's no filter. Maybe I'm just being a paranoid guy. This is what we're going to do. We're going to do just like normal VPNing, but when the ISP, or excuse me, when the broker talks to me, the client, the broker is going to send that back to me in the clear. No encryption whatsoever. In fact, it is going to spoof the source IP. It's going to totally pretend to be Google. It's going to totally pretend to be Bing. Why would it be so open? Because I want the ISP to see my traffic as Google or Bing. I want the ISP to see my consistent normalized server over my consistent normalized path communicating back to me with different identities, and I want it to apply policy. Because if it applies policy in that particular situation, I know it's not the server. I know it's not the path. I know it's the ISP paying a little more attention than it maybe otherwise should. This works well. Who here sees the bug? You know if you see the bug. Who here sees the bug? Awesome. Let's talk about the bug. You guys are great. So what about forward flow? The policy engine in this scenario, does this match the bug you all thought it was, by the way? Yeah. We're on the same page, guys. The policy engine in this scenario does not see the traffic from the client to the server. See, we've encrypted that flow. So what if the ISP says, we know that there's this neuter out there that is going to go ahead and try to bust us, but we know this neuter can only do half flows. So we are only going to apply our filter when we see all the traffic from the client to the server and all the traffic from the server to the client. You know what? You do that, guys. See, this is where this talk starts getting freaking sneaky. Because this is not about a single fix, because there's no single fix. This talk is about having two fixes where if you defend against one attack, you're busted against the other. Here's how we're going to do it. In normal neuter, we spoof the server to the client. In roto-neuter, we spoof the client to the server. Watch this. You have sample A. And in sample A, the client talks to the real Google. Everything is totally normal. You know, it's just a normal, great, everyday connection. And in sample B, client's still going to talk to Google, but is going to go ahead and encrypt all of his traffic that would normally go to Google, is going to send that over to the broker. And then the broker's going to say, well, I got all this traffic here. I'm going to send that over to Google, and I'm going to spoof the client. From Google's perspective, everything is the same, but from the ISP's perspective, there's now a half flow. I have the same server, Google, with the same network path, the path from Google to through ISP to user, but I now have a full flow and a half flow, and if those two have two different performance characteristics, y'all are busted. So, this is the end game. Bias policies might as well be transparent because they're not going to be deniable. If the ISP applies policy to half flows, neuter can go ahead and detect the difference with a standardized server. If it applies policies only to full flows, roto-neuter can differentiate normal traffic to a real host versus halfway flow injected traffic to the same real host. However, I'm not done yet. Probably should be done, but 10 minutes left? Awesome. Let's check it out. Now we're going to play some real games here. Let's say you really do want the ISP to see bidirectional traffic to over the network connection. Why would you want this? Well, it's guaranteed to trigger all policies because you're really sending the right traffic. Also, there might be NATs in the way that you would like to go ahead and trigger their port rules. See, NATs are set up that they really only want to allow inbound packets, like, I don't know, server to client SYN-ACKs, if they see the outbound SYN, if they see that there's an actual outbound link that's trying to get set up. So it's very nice if you can do this, but here's the problem. If the NAT is seeing the client to server traffic, if the ISP is seeing the client to server traffic, gosh darn it, the real server is going to see the client to server traffic, and it's going to be like, what the heck is going on here? What is this other broker that's spoofing traffic from me? Reset, ACK, oh my God, world's coming to an end. So how do we deal with that? Well, the first strategy is very simple and actually surprisingly effective. Yes, that's right, it's 2011, and we have a use for a bad TCP checksum. What we do is the client can go ahead and it can broker all of its traffic like normal through the, through the broker. So, client talks to broker, broker talks to Microsoft, Google, whatnot, and traffic comes back over the open link. But we add something where the client is also sending traffic to the real Microsoft, to the real Bing, to the real Google, whoever. And normally this would cause responses. But if there's a bad TCP checksum, hopefully the bad TCP checksum is ignored because that would take CPU on a NAT device. It would take TPU on a policy device. So that the TCP packet, the SYN and everything else, goes out, just like normal, passes all the machines, sets all the policies, gets to the destination. The destination stack, being an actual, real, heavy-duty stack, says, this is a corrupt packet, I'm going to drop it on the floor. So this can work. The disadvantage is that the policy engine might be set up to look for bad TCP checksums. The NAT might actually fix the TCP checksum when it changes the source IP. If the NAT doesn't do that, though, and if all we have to worry about is the policy engine triggering its filters or not, well, we have them in another catch-22. Because if a policy is disabled when the checksums are bad, you basically have a situation where I go ahead and I intentionally communicate to Google with bad TCP checksums, and for some reason Google's replying, almost like there's some other box that's totally providing real packets with real checksums. And so Google's replying, client's talking to server with bad checksums, Google's talking to client with good checksums. If the policy is not triggered, then you know there's a policy engine that is looking for checksum and is twiddling itself on and off. So you're still busted. But low TTL, this is pretty old school. This talk is actually a sequel to my old Black Ops talk in 2002, which also played games with low TTLs. Here's what you do. Turns out you can send traffic on a network that only goes a certain number of hops. So client is talking to the real server. This is stuff we don't want the real server to see. We set the TTL to about 4. So, it gets out past the NAT, it gets out past the ISP, and then it dies in the middle of the internet. And you might say, but Dan, maybe there are ICMP errors. Well, it turns out there's very convenient hops on the internet that they kind of think ICMP time exceeded messages aren't too cool. So you send it to that many hops, and then your packets die in the middle of the internet. So the advantage here is that it's totally legitimate traffic. Even traffic with a low TTL is legitimate because trace routes are real things you use to debug networks. Disadvantage, the policy engine could go ahead and notice the low TTL and manipulate your traffic anyway. And also if a router is, or choose not to manipulate traffic with low TTL. Also, routers, when they do send ICMP time exceeded messages, it goes through their CPU. You're sort of kind of denial of service attacking a router CPU out on the internet, which isn't exactly cool. However, it's another catch-22 because, hey, look, that policy engine is doing different things based on whether or not it sees traffic and decides it needs to deal with it. Now, not only can we find out there's a policy engine, we can figure out which hop it's in. This is how we tell if it's the ISP filtering versus someone like farther on. It's like, well, we're just going to only let our policy twiddling traffic go just far enough to hit the ISP, and then poof. So now the final game. All right, here's me wanting perfection. It's supposed to be the fact that when a TCP stack receives traffic that is not actually associated with an active session, the TCP stack is supposed to reset. The TCP stack is supposed to complain. It's supposed to interfere. However, we have firewalls, and firewalls run on the brilliant concept that all they do is if they don't see something they like, they drop it on the floor because it's like it's on fire or something. For security. You know what? For us, this is the best thing in the world. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to have the client actually connect to Google. Client sends a SYN to Google. Google sends a SYN act to the client. Client acts to Google. There's a session up. And then the broker is going to kill that session. It's going to snipe it with a reset. Okay, well now Google thinks nothing's going on. Client's got a session open. NAT's got a session open. ISP's got a session open. Broker's going to go ahead and create its own session to Google. And after creating that session, broker's going to go ahead and NAT its session with Google into the wide open session with the client, with the NAT, with the ISP. Now, client can send traffic to the server, who will ignore it because it's outside the firewall. Server can send traffic to the client, who will accept it because it's part of an established session. Client talks to server, server talks to client. You can't explain that. So where are we with the, so bit of warning, if you are potentially in the audience and passively monitoring network traffic, these techniques do kind of mean that any individual node in a TCP communication can actually make you think any other node is saying anything. So all your passive monitors, if you be sure and you validate checksums and you check your TTLs and you make sure weird things like I just described aren't happening, you're fine. But if you're not logging this, I can make any IP in the world look like it's sending an MP3 to anyone else. So, be careful there. Where Neuter is now, it emulates half flows at present. It's very fast. It turns out that my old libpaketo code from college is still good. It supports anything written over IP. If you want to know whether a network supports Xbox 360 traffic as compared to PlayStation 3, Neuter will tell you. It is totally neutral. You don't have to write any pre-code. It just works. It's just a VPN that exposes traffic when it feels like it. So, summary of this entire talk. Networks are cool. Bitcoin is not anonymous. UPnP sometimes exposes itself to the outside world. ACLs can be bypassed if you're willing to send large amounts of traffic. Passwords can be used to seed asymmetric crypto, even though they probably shouldn't. And subtle net neutrality hacks are doomed. You should be transparent or you will be busted. Research hosting thanks to NTK of 3Crowd and Docs and Lion Labs. I am looking for some help with release engineering. I hope you have enjoyed my toys. Thank you so much for your time. Is there a minute for questions?
Okay, we finished exactly at the half-hour mark, but since I'll imagine there will be a large demand, I'll be allowing 15 more minutes for questions, so please queue up at the microphone. And if you don't want to participate in the questions, please leave quietly.
You cannot embarrass me with questions, so if there's anything you think doesn't work,
I'm going to try.
feel free.
What happens if the client and the broker are behind the same filter rules?
I can't understand what you were saying.
Like,
Speak louder, please.
you're trying to find filter rules on the client, right?
Wait, what?
Like network neutrality. The client, you're trying to figure out whether the ISP is filtering the client in some way.
Yes,
What happens if the same filter rules apply to your broker? So if like all the ISPs in the world silently do a monopoly on the filter rules.
Good luck with that. See, it's real easy to go ahead and put a filter in front of an ISP because, well, there's not that much competition at the last mile side. I'm sitting right off a tier 1 where it's, multi-tens of gigabits. There's no filters fast enough to deal with the flows that I'm in, so that's not entirely true. But the reality is that the basic answer, the question is, what if the filter is also in front of the broker and not just the home user ISP? And the answer is that there's a large amount of competition at the network core that would prevent such filters from happening versus there's a relatively small amount of competition at the edge where there's potential for charging rents to have, say, I don't know, Bing 50 milliseconds faster than Google.
Hi, I have a question about BGP aspect of this.
Okay.
What if the ISP that you're trying to figure out if they're using the filtering policies, what if they apply filtering policies for the BGP based on the routing registry? In that case, they would not believe that you have the right to announce the Google addresses to them.
Okay. URPF and all the filtering stuff works very, very, very well if you are controlling the edge side. So if you've just got like a bunch of nodes that are cable modems and DSL wide, oh yeah, spoofing doesn't work. In the real world, not in network mystery magic land, but in the real world, if you're anywhere near the core, you're so far away from being able to be filtered that you can pretend to be anyone. And you will pretty much always, that will always be the case. And it's mainly because of the fact that you don't really know a priori. You don't know the valid interfaces that traffic is going to come in on, because everybody has enough links where it is actually possible that Google could route through you. I mean, this isn't theoretical, right? Like, I didn't come up here and do a big talk on code I've never seen. Like, I'm spoofing the internet today. It's kind of fun. So just to be clear, you know what? I was a little rude, and I want to apologize, like, just for being blunt. But the thinking has been that eventually we'll be able to know where traffic is supposed to come in from. And there's best practices called BCP38. There's a technology called URPF, and it's all supposed to make it so you know when you receive a packet that it came from a source that was able to send that packet. And it's a brilliant and beautiful idea, and it totally doesn't scale. Like, it hits this like really low level of functionality. You get to like even like a low level ISP, and its odds are high enough that you might be able to send that traffic. That URPF is it doesn't work. We have to admit this. This does not make me the most popular guy with networking people, by the way. So, welcome to the truth. Any other questions? Go ahead. Are there any other questions?
If not, we can please thank our speaker. We have one from the Flow Controller.
Wait, I can't see you. Where are you? Oh, there. Okay.
I'm here.
Hey.
A question from the internet.
Yeah, we have some question on the IRC channel. The guys are discussing if the broker needs to have the same return path from Google like the client has from Google, because if it's not the same path, they're expecting some difficulties.
So the game is not to try to match the path in the normal neuter mode. The game is to go ahead and get the entire internet behind a consistent path and behind a consistent server. And that way we're eliminating differences that might come from paths and servers. If Bing is 50 milliseconds slower, there's just too many other causes of that than just say, well, it's slower, my ISP must be evil. And this is a problem, by the way. People are accusing ISPs of tons of evil things that they wish they had the technical talent to implement. So the game is not to match the path for the server to client game. The game is merely to normalize the path across all internet hosts, and assume, which is a reasonable assumption, that the ISP can't really filter and say, wait a second, this is Google coming in from the wrong path. Now, the other direction is using the real path to Google. So for roto-neuter, you really are going ahead and talking to Google. You're just twiddling the bit about whether the ISP sees the full flow or whether they see a half flow. And you're also betting that you can go ahead and spoof the ISP to Google, which again is totally doable. I mean, this is just the empirical reality of it. Any other questions?
Okay, then please, as before, when you're leaving, please clear up all your dirt and all your friends' dirt. Please give feedback in the schedule. Also, next up is Harald Welte's talk on Tetra, which I heard some weird rumor wasn't happening, but I saw him today and he's probably here. And please give a last applause for our speaker.